I sang that song for more than 60 years, a song of praise to Joseph Smith, the prophet of the Restoration and founder of the LDS Church, the church I served as a bishop for 5 years. I knew the church was true. I was a faithful Latter-day Saint. My life has been built on certain truths, but wishing doesn't change the truth. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free." When I finally learned the truth about the real history and doctrines of Mormonism, I realized that I was following the gospel of Joseph Smith and not the gospel of Jesus Christ. I have come to learn that many others have made a similar journey out of the bondage of religion and into an authentic relationship with Jesus. And that's what this show is all about. Courageous people who want to share their story, hoping that you, the viewer, will discover the same new life in Jesus. So if you're a Latter-day Saint who is struggling with questions or seeking a genuine encounter with the Savior, we invite you to join us tonight. We have a joyful message that we want to share with you. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Ex-Mormon Files. I'm your host, Bishop Earl, and I appreciate you spending some time watching us and appreciate your support. I'm really thrilled tonight to introduce to you Richard Dutcher. You may know that name. He's a filmmaker. He's made some movies that you may have seen: God's Army, Brigham City, and States of Grace. One of a movie that I've just recently watched, and I'm just thrilled with it. It's just has such an interesting impact and a great storyline. He's the producer, the writer, not in States of Grace, right? Producer, but
I was a producer. Yeah,
were you?
I wasn't acting in States of Grace, so
Right.
that's when I took a sabbatical there.
Also acted in, was Elder Dalton in God's Army.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So Richard, it's nice to have you here, and you've got
great to
such
be
a
here.
rich story, and we'll get right into it. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, and
Oh, you
about
want to
your
start from the
family?
beginning?
Yeah.
So,
Back in Illinois, I believe, right?
yeah, born in Chicago, Illinois, and grew up mostly in southern Illinois. My family was from there for generations back, and so religiously my father's family was Baptist, my mother's family was Pentecostal, and so we lived mostly around my mother's family, so I grew up in the Pentecostal church in Mount Vernon, Illinois.
Wow.
And we were Pentecostal until a Mormon businessman came pulling into town in his Lincoln Continental, and my mother fell for the guy and married him. Obviously, we were divorced.
Yeah.
My father and her had divorced. And so then he took us off on an adventure that took us to Wisconsin and Kentucky and eventually Utah. And so he made us, he kind of adopted me into Mormonism when I was, so I was baptized at 8, like most.
Was your mom converted then? Did she
My
become
mother was.
a member?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember, though, it was funny, just a little funny story. They were all baptized by my stepfather, but I still didn't like him very much, so I requested that one of the missionaries baptize me, whose name was Elder Dalton.
Oh, interesting.
And so I was baptized by Elder Dalton, and the rest of my family was baptized by my stepfather.
Wow. Well, now you, as a Pentecostal, I understood that from an interview that you had done earlier, is on Mormon Stories, by the way, that you weren't allowed to go to films.
No, we weren't allowed to see movies.
What an interesting twist in your life, then, huh?
Yeah, we could see television at home, but we couldn't go to the movies.
Yeah.
And so when the Mormon guy came around, the first time I saw a film was when I was 7 years old, and it was John Wayne and the Cowboys.
Yeah.
And I saw it at the Granada Theater in Mount Vernon, Illinois, which was one of those big Art Deco things built in the 30s. And,
Right.
and it was such a powerful experience for me that I mean, it changed everything. I still remember just the drive home. Everything in the world was so much more alive for me and real.
To see.
And I just knew I didn't know what it was. I was too young, and I didn't, my family had nothing to do with the film industry whatsoever. And so for me, it was like I didn't know what that was, but I knew I wanted to be a part of it.
Yeah.
And it was interesting for the way that Mormonism and my love of film kind of came into my life at the same time. And then throughout most of my life until I left Mormonism, it was a very interesting dance, struggle, fight, and occasionally, occasionally compatible
Yeah.
passions.
Yeah. Well, so you were active as a deacon teacher, the seminary thing, and all that. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I was active, but I was always I was the little kid. So when bishops always call the tall kids to be the leaders of everything.
Is that how we do it?
That's how you do it.
That's inspiration for sure.
I noticed as a short person, it's like, all the way through from deacon up till you're in the mission field, it's always the tall guys that get the leadership callings. And so I was always
That was
the
on
guy
page 3 or 4. I didn't get that far. So.
I was the studious. I was very sincere, studious. I went through periods of intense rebellion. Of course, I hit 16 and suddenly, I took a couple of years off.
As many do.
As many do.
Yeah.
Then I served a mission and went to southern Mexico.
I thought it was interesting. I remember hearing you say that someone had always asked you, well, where do you want to go on your mission?
Oh, and I would say anywhere but Mexico. Yeah, and I knew it, and it was the strangest thing when I got that mission call.
Yeah.
I hadn't even opened the paper yet, and I just knew that it was Mexico, and I was not looking forward to opening that up.
But it turned out to be a great experience.
It was an amazing mission.
Yeah.
I had a great experience. I was thrown in jail. I was in these tiny villages with no other gringos around
Really?
for miles and miles, and it was mine was an adventure. I had a great adventure.
Yeah. Well, now,
thank God I wasn't sent to Provo or something
yeah,
like that.
you felt certainly had a testimony of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. In fact, you mentioned being studious. You'd read probably what you felt was a lot more than other missionaries had ever studied.
Oh,
right?
yeah, I was pretty serious about it. I took it very seriously. So I remember starting to read the Old Testament when I was 14 and and finishing. And by the time I was in the mission field, I'd already read the Old Testament a couple of times, and the Book of Mormon 7 or 8 times, the New Testament, 7 or 8 times.
Wow.
So
that's
unusual.
A lot different, yeah.
Whereas the other missionaries, some of them didn't know that the Book of Moroni wasn't in the Old Testament.
That's
It's
right.
that.
Where do I find these books or the scriptures?
Yeah. So for me, it was always the religion itself was. And I don't know if it's just because I'm a reader, I like to read, but it was always very scripturally based. I was very interested always, not so much in the culture. I'm not an extrovert. I'm a little bit more introverted than most, I think. And so the social aspects of Mormonism weren't as important to me as the
Doctrine,
the
history.
yeah, exactly.
that
The
kind of
history,
stuff.
the doctrine, the narrative, which, to me, which is a very powerful narrative. I think back on this now, we talk about Mormonism coming into my life as a 7-year-old boy.
Yeah.
And that particular narrative, of a 14-year-old boy seeking truth and seeking God and going into the woods and having a vision and starting this movement, and it's the Old West with guns and and the frontier, and it's like that is a very powerful narrative that I can see why, as a young boy, that really appealed to me.
Yeah.
Plus all the women that he
Yeah.
had.
Well, and it feels good.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole thing.
It's a great story.
Yeah,
It's a great
it
story.
is. So you end up coming home from your mission, then what happens?
Came home from my mission, worked a little bit, visited my parents at that time. Stepfather and mother had also divorced, and my mother had left the church, and my father was about to be ushered out of the church
Okay. Okay.
unwillingly.
Yeah.
And so I visited them, went to BYU to study film because not out of any religious conviction, but they had offered the best scholarship. So
for film program. They have a wonderful program, right?
Well, actually, I didn't get a scholarship for film. I got it for leadership or journalism or something.
Oh.
So that's why I went to BYU. Spent 3 years there. Met a great lady while I was there. Got married, and then immediately afterwards, we packed up our little Plymouth Horizon with everything we owned and went off to Los Angeles to see what we could make happen.
Oh. In the process, then, you're still active in the church?
Still active, yeah. Well, actually, during BYU, I wasn't very active. I have a...
In the student wards, you mean?
Yeah, I was not active because I think just my personality... Well, it's the same thing when we moved to Utah when I was a teenager. We moved to Salt Lake City, and that's when I became inactive. There's something about... I don't want to be part of the majority. There's something in me that just rebels against. So it's been pretty much every time I've come to a place where every time in my life where I went to a place, whether it was BYU, whether it was Salt Lake as a teenager, and when I came back, eventually to Utah, there's just something about it that I just cannot be a part of the majority. It's there's a nonconformist part of me that, and there's something that's
I think
you see
call that
to me
thinking or something. Don't
yeah,
they,
well,
sometimes?
and the falseness and the evils of evils is the wrong word, but
Hypocrisy is
the
there, is that in there?
hypocrisies, the cultural aberrations
Yeah.
that you don't see in Mormonism when you're in California, when you're in Kentucky. The community is different,
More prevalent here in Utah.
but when you get into the heart of the culture and in the heart of the monoculture, it expresses itself in a way that I actually can't. I find repulsive, and I just can't be a part of it.
You're very sensitive to that kind of.
Yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does, absolutely.
But
yeah,
there's a great quote in the movie, I think it's Boys in the Hood, where the dad's telling his boy, where he's like, anytime you see if you see a group of people, walk in the other direction or something like that. That's always
Don't be
the way.
part of the crowd.
Yep. Yeah. Or if there's a great quote, what is it? If you find yourself a part of the majority, you better stop and question it or something like that. I can't remember. But that's the way I naturally think.
So tell us what went on in LA then? Did you begin doing films?
Well, I went to Los Angeles to learn basically, to make independent film. That was the whole point.
Yeah.
And so I would try to get any job as an actor, as a director, as a writer. And of course, I was a young, inexperienced kid with all I had was a film degree from BYU. I didn't get much work. I got a little work, but I didn't get much work. But I learned a lot.
Started learning the trade. Yeah.
Right. And then I made my first full-length film while I was down there. And that is where I really learned how to make, that was the real education. College was,
yeah, that's
what it was.
Get you through that.
But
so tell us about God's Army then. Was that wasn't this first film?
No, the first film was called Girl Crazy.
Okay.
And then I had and that had been a very difficult film to make. It had taken me about 4 to 5 years to the whole process of trying to raise money, trying to get it made, finally getting it shot, editing it, trying to raise the money to finish it, and then it was from the time I started it until I finally sold it to HBO Cinemax. It was about 5 years, and I had decided at that point that it was just a fluffy little romantic comedy, wasn't going to make any difference in anyone's life. Nobody would think about it 30 minutes after they saw it. And so I decided I was never going to do that again because I'd risked so much and invested so much, and it had been so much of my life that I just decided I'm not going to do that again. If I'm going to make another film, and I am going to make another film, it's going to have to be something that is worth 5 years of my life.
Yeah, because it takes that kind of a commitment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And your wife was okay with everything?
My wife was very supportive. She was, she met me. I was a poor actor at BYU.
Yeah.
Nothing, no money, no car. All I had was charm and cockiness, and so, and she knew what I was going to do. I wasn't, Yeah,
and I don't know if it was mentioned earlier, but you do have 7 children.
I have 7 children.
Yeah, and so she was busy and And
They came. They didn't all come at once,
No,
though.
of
They
course not.
came. Our first child came, Lucas. He came about 3 years after we were married, and then about every 3 years after that, we had another baby. So we that was just. But it was an adventure, being a young, struggling filmmaker in Los Angeles was an adventure. And then I made God's Army there, and again, it did turn out again to be a 5-year process of, because it was so hard to raise money and convince people that a movie about Mormon missionaries would be something that would work, would make money. So it took me a very long time to get that going. And once I had it, I knew that I was going to begin marketing it here in Utah.
Okay.
And so I thought, I'm going to be in Utah for at least 9 months to a year. I don't want to be away from my family, so we just decided to move back.
Come back to Utah, okay.
And
that was around 2000
that
or
was
so.
the year 2000.
And it was very popular, God's Army.
It was.
What kind of responses did you get?
It was very satisfying. I remember there was a Mormon friend of mine, Rick, who's an editor down in Los Angeles, and he knew how I was working on this film for so long, and I told him, we were I think we were out and watched some bad movie in Glendale, and I think it was a Robin Williams movie, but there was a line down the block, and I told him, I was like, when I finish God's Army, there's going to be lines around the block to watch this movie. He was like, yeah. But I was convinced. I mean, and to me, it was just it was a no-brainer. It was like, if, Mormons don't have they're not like Pentecostals, they can see movies, they love movies.
Yeah. Especially about themselves, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they hadn't really had any. That was the point.
Yeah.
And so I just broke it down into numbers, and I was like, I went and found out exactly how many living ex-missionaries there were, and I said, if only 5% of all living ex-missionaries see this film, we're going to make money.
We could break.
And even with those kind of numbers, I had the hardest time. And you know what it was? This is I went at it. I was a very idealistic young man, so I always went at it. I went at these rich Mormon guys, and it was always this feeling of mission, like we should do this. This is something that, I think the Lord. Let's spread the word.
Yeah, sure.
And then one day I woke up because it wasn't working. After years of that approach, it wasn't working. And so finally, after hearing a Hugh Nibley talk where he talked about the things that everybody wants, or money, what is it? Money, sex, power, and fame. He goes, that's it. That's what everybody, and I started to focus on that with the rich Mormons. And so I was, instead of trying to hook them with, let's do some good, it was, I'm going to make you a lot of money.
Yeah. Did that was a little more successful.
And that was a far more successful approach. So
Interesting.
I learned an interesting lesson there.
Well, you've had such a rich experience of all kinds of things, but tell us a little bit about then what kind of brought you to a point where you were questioning the church? What happened there?
Well, in essence, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I had been a very, as I mentioned, very studious.
Yeah.
And they talk about, having the shelf behind you and all the things you put on the shelf that, there's no answers for. And as I mentioned to you in a private conversation, I kind of prided myself on being this great apologist for Mormonism. You could bring up anything, and I could explain.
You'd have an answer for it.
How it would, how to explain it.
Yeah.
And that included, Joseph Smith playing around with Orson Hyde's wife while he was off dedicating the Holy Land. I mean, I had answers for everything. And I had gotten to a point in my life where it was an interesting place because now my career was very much a part of my livelihood was very much a part of my spiritual journey.
Sure.
And my church affiliation. And I was living the gospel as I understood it, the Mormon, gospel, Mormon point of view on the gospel, as well as I think I humanly could. There wasn't, people say, this is one thing that actually made me get up and leave a church one time after I'd had my experience, but there was a stake counselor in the stake presidency or stake high councilman who came to, and he talked about, he was quoting some former prophet, and he said, nobody loses their testimony except through sin. And I was so offended by that because it was like, I knew that was not my story
true.
at all.
Yeah.
But to get back to it, I was
Mine either.
yeah. But that's the and that's what
Yeah.
I found afterwards was that was the understanding. Everybody was like, "Oh, he left the church. He must
be
have
sinning, or-
he's up to something."
Yeah,
You know, we don't
yeah.
know what it is, but he's up to something. I did get up to some things later, but that's not when I left the church. But yeah. So in short, there is. You mentioned the Mormon Stories interview, and if anybody's interested in kind of an in-depth, we spent a lot of time talking about this. But in short, as an
Yeah,
answer
wonderful
to prayer,
Yeah.
you know, after prayer, I was just sitting and meditating, and I asked myself a question that I hadn't asked myself since I was 14 years old. When I was seeking my testimony at that point, I just asked myself, what if it's just not true? And there was this, the best I can describe it, it was the most clear, the most pure, the most direct voice that was from the deepest part of me, just said, of course it's not true. And it was as shocking as it was so strange to me, because one minute I was an active, believing Latter-day Saint. I knew who God was. I knew what the universe was. I knew my place in it.
You know where you fit in, and
Right, and then, you know, literally 30 seconds later, I knew that I knew nothing, and it was absolutely terrifying. And I've described it. It was like I was sitting in bed with my back against the wall. And it was like, I felt it was like those movies, the Star Wars or whatever, where you see or in space movies where, you know, one piece of the spacecraft disengages and it just kind of starts to drift
floating
off.
away.
And you know it's just going to continue forever to drift away farther and farther, and there's no
And
way
never
you can
come
get it
back,
back. And
yeah.
it was like that. It felt like my faith had disengaged, and I could actually just kind of feel it like it was leaving, and there was no coming back.
And have you learned or confirmed over the years now that that was a good answer to your prayer?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely terrifying though, because to me at that point it was like, what do I do
This is
with
your whole
this
life.
now?
Yeah.
I mean, my family, I'm raising children.
Yeah.
We're everybody.
I mean, you're temple recommend holder, and you've been
right,
through the temple.
and I'm known as a Mormon filmmaker, as the Mormon filmmaker, you know, and
That's right.
as the father of Mormon cinema.
Yeah.
And it was hard, and it took me, I mean, it was like a year and a half of me, well, interestingly, right after I had this experience, I was able to pull together the funding to make this movie, States of Grace.
Oh,
And so I went off to Los Angeles to make that with my head still in the space of like, I don't know what is going on. And holding on to the script that I had written, and yet trusting in God that He would pull me through it, you know?
Well, the story of States of Grace just includes Mormons and their challenges and other Christian ideals. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story. But I did like one thing that you said about talking about this, was that the answer that you got really answered all the other questions that you had,
Right.
the ones on the shelf. Just
Right.
that one answer
Right.
of Joseph Smith, I suppose, just coming to grips with that answers all those other questions.
Right.
Takes care of the polygamy and the Masonry and the
Right.
Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, and it just...
Right. Well, that's something I found as an amateur apologist was, you know, you'd go from one, and I kind of look at it as, you know, you'd go from one tree to the next in the forest, and you'd argue about that tree, and then you'd come to a standstill.
Yeah.
Then you move on to the next tree. But eventually you've got 300 trees, you've got an entire forest here, and you can spend all your time working on these trees, but if you step back and look at the whole forest, there's one answer that solves everything, you know, and that's what became very clear to me.
Wow.
Clear to me at that point. And so it is the one thing I think I've had so many people say, you know, you took the easy way out, and people have no
That
idea.
isn't the
In
easy
fact,
way.
the easy way out would have been just to stay.
You've sacrificed a lot.
Yeah. I even had a friend when I was trying to figure out what to do, and I said, I think I have to, come out and tell people that I don't believe anymore. I have to leave. I have to really leave. I was no longer attending, but everyone assumed that
You were busy or doing something, yeah.
And he told me, just don't do it. I was like, why? He's like, well, you're never going to get funding for your films. And it was like, well, I can't stay. I can't stay and pretend to believe something that I no longer believe so that I can get funding for my films. That's pathetic. That was.
Have you felt a freedom from all this? Has it been a good journey for you?
It's been a good journey, but a very, very hard one. I've lost so much. So much. But I don't see how I could have done anything else, if that makes any sense. I don't see how you can live any other way, so.
I felt the same way. I mean, once the eyes are open, once you see things the way they are, there's no backing. You can't, like you're saying, drifting apart. You're never going to go back there.
Right.
Yeah.
And for me, it was interesting because I was trying to work my way through this entire, what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this? And one night I was in a restaurant in Sandy, Tiburon restaurant, and I decided I wanted a glass of red wine, so I was drinking a glass of red wine. And I happened to look over to the table, and there was some guy over there who was giving me the dirtiest look, just the nastiest look. And I realized he recognizes me. He knows who I am. He doesn't know that I no longer believe and that I've left the church.
Oh.
And then within a couple of days, I was in a grocery store, and some sister came up to me in Springville, I think it was, and she was telling me how much I inspired her son to go on a mission, and which was great. I don't, I still love to hear those stories, but I felt like she was thinking that I was someone that I wasn't, and so I felt duplicitous.
Yeah.
And I knew that the guy at the restaurant thought that I was a hypocrite, even though I wasn't. And so at that point, the Daily Herald actually in Provo had asked me to write something, so I wrote this basically an exit to my exit from Mormonism. And as soon as I went out publicly and said, I no longer believe, I've left the church, that's when things got especially difficult, because some people were very angry about that.
Well, Richard, I know people are going to wish we had a lot more time, and maybe we'll have to rearrange this and give you another opportunity to share a little bit more, because you have such a rich story. And as someone who has sacrificed a lot, I know you've given up a lot for your faith, but you wouldn't change anything, right? Yeah. So thanks, Richard. I appreciate it very much, and appreciate you watching, and we'll catch you on another episode of Ex-Mormon Files.